The celebration always looks justified at the time. Prosperity feels earned. Growth feels permanent. Risk feels conquered. In every era where societies believed they had finally mastered economic uncertainty, the final years were marked not by caution, but by confidence. Expansion dinners. Credit-fueled abundance. Public optimism reinforced by private leverage. The pattern does not announce itself as excess. It announces itself as success. Before the Roman denarius collapsed under its own dilution, the empire hosted festivals funded by future tax receipts. Before the South Sea bubble burst, London overflowed with new wealth, new titles, new estates purchased with money that did not yet exist. Before the 1929 crash, champagne flowed through Manhattan hotels while margin debt quietly reached levels never seen before. Before the global financial crisis, risk was not feared. It was packaged, renamed, insured, and celebrated. These moments are not remembered as warnings. They are remembered as golden ages, periods when productivity seemed infinite and limits appeared obsolete. Debt did not feel like burden. It felt like momentum. Each new innovation, financial or technological, reinforced the belief that the old rules no longer applied. Scarcity was a relic. Cycles were outdated. Stability was assumed. What history reveals is not that people ignored danger. It is that danger disguised itself as reward. The party was never irrational within the logic of the moment. Incentives aligned toward participation. Growth was rewarded. Caution was punished. Those who stepped aside appeared foolish, while those who leaned in were elevated, promoted, enriched. Institutions adjusted to support expansion. Narratives evolved to justify it. The system learned to protect the feeling of prosperity, even as its foundations thinned. Recessions do not begin with panic. They begin with applause, with rising asset prices interpreted as proof, with consumption accelerating faster than production, with debt expanding faster than income, with confidence detaching from capacity. Long before unemployment rises or markets fall, something quieter shifts. The system stops asking whether growth is durable and starts assuming it must be. This is why the warning signs rarely feel like warnings. They look like crowded restaurants, not empty factories, like record profits, not collapsing margins, like optimism surveys and policy assurances and carefully constructed explanations for why this expansion is structurally different from all the others. By the time restraint feels necessary, restraint is no longer possible. Every recession begins after the party is already in full swing, not because people are reckless, but because the system rewards those who stay until the lights flicker. By the time the music slows, the exits are crowded, and the bill, deferred for years, finally arrives all at once. The unsettling truth is not that this pattern has happened before. It is that it is happening again, quietly, predictably, and exactly as it always does. Collapse is rarely experienced as collapse while it is unfolding. It does not arrive with a single shock or a visible rupture. It begins as distortion, as imbalance, as a growing gap between what an economy produces and what it promises. At first, the system absorbs the strain, then it normalizes it. Eventually, it depends on it. Large-scale economic breakdown follows a remarkably consistent trajectory across centuries and systems. The early stages are not destructive. They are often celebrated. Productivity increases, trade expands, institutions grow more complex. Success generates confidence, and confidence generates leverage. Debt rises not because of desperation, but because optimism lowers perceived risk. Credit becomes a tool of acceleration rather than support. Growth shifts from organic output to financial engineering. As expansion continues, incentives slowly change. It becomes easier to extract value than to create it. Financial returns begin to outpace real productivity. Consumption accelerates faster than wages. Asset prices rise independent of underlying cash flows. This is not immediately destabilizing. In fact, it feels like efficiency. Capital is working harder. Markets appear deeper and more sophisticated. Risk, at least on paper, seems dispersed. The next phase is subtle but decisive. Institutions adapt to preserve the expansion. Rules soften. Standards adjust. Short-term stability is prioritized over long-term resilience. Policies are framed as temporary, but they recur often enough to become permanent. Each intervention solves an immediate problem while deepening the structural one beneath it. The system grows larger but less flexible. As distortions compound, productivity begins to stagnate. Innovation continues, but its gains are increasingly captured by financial intermediaries rather than broadly distributed. Debt servicing absorbs a growing share of economic output. The system can still function, but only under increasingly narrow conditions. Growth becomes dependent on constant confidence. Any interruption, however small, threatens disproportionate consequences. At this stage, collapse is no longer optional. It is deferred. And deferral requires acceleration, more credit, more leverage, more narrative control. The economy appears stable precisely because it has lost the ability to absorb shock. Volatility is suppressed. Signals are muted. Risks accumulate invisibly. Eventually, the final stage arrives not as a decision, but as a constraint. Confidence falters, not suddenly, but unevenly. Certain sectors weaken. Certain borrowers fail. Institutions respond as they have before, but the tools no longer work as expected. Each intervention delivers diminishing returns. Trust erodes faster than policy can restore it. The system crosses a threshold where reversal is no longer possible without contraction. Collapse in reality is a slow migration through these stages: expansion, leverage, distortion, dependence, fragility, and then release. The release may look like a recession, a depression, or a prolonged stagnation. The form varies. The sequence does not. Understanding this pattern is essential because it reveals why recessions do not begin with visible failure. They begin when success outpaces sustainability, when the party becomes the system's primary proof of health. When growth must continue not because it is productive, but because stopping would expose how little stability remains underneath. Once this framework is visible, history stops feeling chaotic. Different names, different eras, the same structure. And nowhere is this more clearly illustrated than in the empires that believed their dominance exempted them from decline. At its height, the Roman Empire appeared economically indestructible. It commanded the most advanced infrastructure of the ancient world. Roads connected continents. Ports moved grain, metals, and luxury goods across vast distances. Taxation was sophisticated. Administration was centralized. Rome did not merely conquer territory. It integrated economies into a single monetary and trade system that funneled wealth toward the core. For centuries, this structure worked. Expansion delivered new resources, new labor, and new revenue streams. Productivity rose as conquered regions were reorganized for output. Trade flourished under enforced stability. The empire's currency, the denarius, became a trusted medium of exchange across Europe and the Mediterranean. Confidence in Rome was confidence in order itself. But Rome's advantages carried hidden costs. Military expansion required permanent expenditure. Administration grew more complex with each new province. The system demanded constant inflows to sustain its scale. When territorial expansion slowed, the economic logic shifted. Wealth continued to circulate, but it no longer grew at the same pace. The state's obligations remained fixed. Its revenues did not. To bridge the gap, Rome turned to monetary distortion. Silver content in the denarius was gradually reduced, not as an act of desperation, but as policy. Each debasement appeared manageable. Prices adjusted slowly at first. Trade continued. The illusion of continuity held. But the underlying signal was clear. The empire was spending future value to maintain present stability. Debt, though less formalized than in modern systems, accumulated through obligations to soldiers, contractors, and provincial elites. Productivity in the core declined as wealth concentrated in land-holding aristocracies who favored extraction over reinvestment. Small farmers were displaced. Urban populations grew dependent on state distributions of grain. Consumption remained high, but it was no longer supported by broad-based production. As inequality widened, social cohesion weakened. The empire increasingly relied on spectacle and subsidy to maintain legitimacy. Public games, festivals, and distributions were not merely cultural features. They were economic stabilizers. They absorbed surplus currency and reinforced the appearance of abundance. The party continued, even as the foundations eroded. Meanwhile, wealth flowed through Rome but failed to remain within it. Trade imbalances drained precious metals eastward. Military spending enriched frontier suppliers more than domestic producers. Capital circulation accelerated, but retention diminished. The system grew larger, yet thinner. When shocks arrived, plagues, external pressures, internal instability, the empire lacked flexibility. Tax burdens increased to compensate, further suppressing productivity. Monetary debasement accelerated, undermining trust. By the time reform was attempted, confidence in the currency and the state had already fractured. Rome did not fall in a moment. It hollowed out. Its economy lost coherence long before its political structures collapsed. The party did not end with silence. It ended with exhaustion. A system that once generated wealth at scale could no longer sustain itself without distortion. And when distortion became the norm, decline became inevitable. Rome's story is not unique because it was ancient. It is unique because it was early. Later systems would repeat the same sequence, armed with new tools, convinced of their immunity, and equally certain that their prosperity marked a permanent exception. In the early 20th century, the industrial economies of the West believed they had entered a new era of stability. Mass production had transformed output. Electricity, automobiles, and telecommunications compressed time and distance. Financial markets expanded alongside industry, promising to allocate capital with unprecedented efficiency. For many, the old cycles of boom and bust appeared increasingly irrelevant. The United States became the clearest expression of this confidence. Productivity surged, corporate profits climbed, stock ownership spread beyond elites into the middle class. Credit was readily available, and its availability was framed not as risk, but as democratization. Buying on margin was considered rational participation in modern growth. Leverage was no longer a warning sign. It was proof of sophistication. A powerful narrative took hold. Economic science, it was believed, had matured. Policymakers spoke openly about a permanently high plateau of prosperity. Market volatility was interpreted as noise rather than signal. Each rally reinforced the belief that the system had corrected its own weaknesses. This time, the party felt earned by innovation rather than speculation. Yet beneath the surface, the same stages were unfolding. Consumption rose faster than wages. Corporate profits increasingly depended on financial leverage rather than productivity gains. Debt expanded through households, brokers, and banks simultaneously. Risk clustered even as it appeared dispersed. Confidence substituted for resilience. Warnings did exist, but they were framed as outdated. Critics were dismissed as pessimists who failed to understand modern conditions. Delay became policy. Intervention was minimal not because risk was low, but because acknowledging risk threatened the narrative of permanence. As long as asset prices rose, the system appeared healthy. When the reversal came, it exposed how thin the margin for error had become. The collapse was not caused by a single event. It was caused by dependence on continuation. Once prices stopped rising, leverage reversed its effect. Forced selling accelerated declines. Credit contracted precisely when it was most needed. The system moved rapidly from euphoria to paralysis. The aftermath revealed the deeper truth. The crash was not an accident. It was the release phase of a structure that had prioritized expansion over stability. Recovery required years of adjustment, regulatory reform, and social realignment. Confidence did not return quickly because it had been misplaced. The most enduring lesson of this period was not the severity of the collapse, but the certainty that preceded it. The belief that progress had eliminated cycles did not prevent the downturn. It accelerated it. By the time reality contradicted the narrative, the system had already passed the point where gradual correction was possible. Every era that declares itself different eventually confronts the same constraint. Innovation changes the surface. Incentives shape the outcome. And the party, no matter how modern it feels, always ends when confidence outruns capacity. In the modern system, the mechanisms are more complex, but the structure is familiar. Productivity gains still exist, but they are increasingly uneven. Certain sectors advance rapidly while the broader economy absorbs the cost through stagnating wages and rising living expenses. Growth remains visible, yet its sources are harder to trace. Output expands, but much of the expansion is financial rather than productive. Debt has become the central organizing force. Governments rely on it to smooth cycles. Corporations use it to amplify returns. Households depend on it to maintain standards of living that income alone no longer supports. None of this is framed as instability. It is framed as management, as optimization, as the responsible use of modern tools. Monetary expansion plays a crucial role in sustaining confidence. Low borrowing costs encourage investment, but they also reward leverage over efficiency. Capital flows toward assets that appreciate rather than enterprises that produce. Financial markets respond quickly and positively. Real economies respond slowly. The gap between valuation and value widens without immediately triggering alarm. Incentives reinforce the behavior. Institutions are judged on short-term performance. Policymakers are rewarded for preventing immediate pain rather than long-term imbalance. Risk is not eliminated, it is postponed. Each cycle of intervention stabilizes the present while narrowing the range of future options. Stability becomes conditional, dependent on continuous support. What makes the modern parallel particularly resilient is narrative alignment. Data is abundant, but interpretation is selective. Rising asset prices are cited as proof of strength. Structural fragility is reframed as transition. Warning signs are acknowledged, then deferred. The system does not deny risk outright. It absorbs it into expectation. This is not the result of malicious intent. It is the outcome of incentive design. When maintaining confidence becomes the primary objective, preserving appearances takes precedence over correcting imbalances. The party persists because too many outcomes depend on it continuing. Markets, institutions, and households adjust their behavior around the assumption of stability. Recessions in this context are not policy failures. They are structural resets. They occur when accumulated distortions overwhelm the mechanisms designed to contain them. The timing is unpredictable. The direction is not. When incentives break, confidence follows. And when confidence erodes, systems built on leverage contract rapidly. The modern economy does not repeat history because it ignores it. It repeats history because it responds to the same pressures, rewards the same behaviors, and defers the same consequences. Different instruments, familiar rhythm, and a celebration that feels necessary right up until it ends. Late-stage systems often feel most stable just before they change. Volatility declines. Crises appear contained. Institutions project control. This is not coincidence. It is the product of years spent smoothing outcomes, dampening signals, and normalizing risk. By the time the system reaches this phase, instability has not disappeared. It has been compressed. Warnings still surface, but they arrive in fragments. Isolated failures, localized stress, temporary dislocations. Each is addressed individually, framed as manageable, disconnected from the whole. The narrative emphasizes resilience. Past interventions are cited as proof of competence. The absence of immediate catastrophe becomes evidence that catastrophe is unlikely. Risk normalization plays a central role. Behaviors that would once have triggered concern become standard practice. High leverage is justified by low rates. Thin margins are excused by scale. Concentration is defended as efficiency. Over time, the system forgets what caution felt like. Participants adapt not to fundamentals, but to policy responses. The expectation of support becomes embedded. Institutional denial rarely takes the form of outright rejection. It is procedural. Problems are studied. Committees are formed. Data is contextualized. Action is delayed in the name of precision. Meanwhile, conditions continue to deteriorate. Each pause is reasonable in isolation. Together, they create inertia. Narrative control tightens as stakes rise. Language shifts. Instability becomes volatility. Contraction becomes rebalancing. Debt becomes liquidity provision. These are not deceptions so much as translations, designed to preserve confidence long enough for solutions to work. But confidence is not neutral. It shapes behavior. It encourages continued participation in a system that has already lost flexibility. Acceleration begins when confidence finally weakens despite reassurance. Small corrections produce outsized reactions. Liquidity thins. Trust erodes unevenly. Some participants exit early. Others are forced to remain. Feedback loops form. The very mechanisms designed to stabilize the system amplify its movement. At this point, options narrow rapidly. Interventions that once calmed markets now raise new questions. Each response signals urgency. Each signal undermines the narrative of control. The system does not collapse because warnings were ignored. It collapses because warnings were managed for too long. The transition from stability to contraction feels sudden only because the groundwork was laid quietly. When acceleration begins, events move faster than interpretation. The party ends not with chaos, but with recognition. Recognition that the system can no longer pretend tomorrow will look like yesterday. History does not repeat because individuals fail to learn. It repeats because systems reward the same behaviors under similar conditions. Expansion favors confidence. Leverage rewards participation. Caution carries an opportunity cost that few are willing to pay while growth appears effortless. The party is not a moral failure. It is an incentive response. Recessions, in this light, are not aberrations. They are recalibrations. They occur when accumulated promises exceed productive capacity, when belief outruns output, when future value has already been spent in the present. The timing is uncertain because confidence is not linear. It holds until it doesn't. Every generation inherits the same dilemma. How much risk to tolerate in pursuit of prosperity? How much stability to sacrifice for growth? The answers change in form, but not in substance. Tools evolve. Language adapts. Human behavior remains remarkably consistent. Understanding this does not grant immunity. Awareness alone cannot override incentives embedded in institutions, markets, and culture. But it does clarify the process. It explains why the signs are subtle, why the party feels rational, why the ending feels abrupt, and why the cycle continues despite centuries of evidence. The pattern persists not because people are reckless, but because systems are designed to expand until constrained. They do not self-correct smoothly. They adjust through disruption. Collapse is not the opposite of order. It is the mechanism through which order resets. Seen this way, economic history becomes less dramatic and more instructive. The rise and fall of systems is not a story of villains and victims. It is a study of feedback loops, of delayed consequences, of optimism that outpaces structure. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.